Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's videogram on grief, the price of love. My name is Mark Moran. I'm an instructor here for some of our Christian counseling courses, but also for some of our grief courses. This is a basic introduction to bereavement, the science of bereavement. And it's essential, I think, also in terms of when someone first wants to learn what grief is, and it is a doorway to the more in-depth theories and therapies that can be used for individuals. So what we're going to look at today is what is grief. And I think this definition really explains it the best. Grief is the absence of the beloved or whatever was lost. So grief is always a reaction to loss itself. It is the transitional period of adjustment to that loss. Grief extremity, however, can vary very much so. Losing a trinket in comparison to the loss of a loved one pales in comparison to the extent. So the amount of connection, the bond, will correlate directly with the extremity of suffering, of grief that coincides with the actual loss itself. But even after, I think it's important to note that even after adjustment, grief always remains. And that's why this videogram is entitled Grief, the Price of Love. Because grief is the absence of the beloved and is the price of that love, it will always leave us with an emptiness, a void. So if love existed, grief will always exist until that love is reunited. So grief in many ways is the price that we have for that love that we share with someone, or that bond that we have. The two cannot exist separately, at least in this world that we live in, this temporal reality. It's a two-sided coin, love and grief. And that's unfortunate, but it also in many ways is beautiful, because even after the loss of someone we love, the grief is a constant reminder that that love can never die. So what we learn from this is grief is really permanent. There is no timeline with grief. There is no true recovery from grief. In the past, with more Freudian sciences, grief was seen as a pathology, and it was important to return to that equilibrium, to that natural state of pre-grief. But as we have learned, there is no return to that. Professionals themselves, grief counselors, licensed professional counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, they all contend that when we're speaking of bereavement, it usually takes 6 months over a serious loss to a year. But remember, and I think this is key, that this is for adjustment, adjusting to the loss, becoming used to not having the person in your life. This is not a recovery, but an adjustment. So as time goes forward, when you lose a parent, lose a child, death anniversaries come, especially that first year, that first death anniversary, holidays, birthdays. They're never the same after that. The stinging reminders of loss will constantly haunt throughout life when those special days come, especially the first year. Now, if you are grieving and you're trying to overcome these feelings, I would say that is something that you shouldn't do. You should embrace the feelings more so and realize that it's okay to continue to feel sad about the particular loss. There is no timeline. Grief is as unique as a fingerprint to each individual. In the science of bereavement, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is a giant. She looked at the basic stages of grief. Now, these are great general guidelines. They're great guidelines for an individual to see how the human psychological response is to something being taken, especially something important, a loved one, a loss of a huge extent. And what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross looked at, and she dealt primarily with the dying. She was in the study of thanatology. She looked at how individuals and families responded to the bad news of a terminal illness. And the stages that were laid out, which she experienced, was usually in a certain order. Being the first, denial. And I think we can all relate to denial. When something bad happens, I know in my life, when I've lost a loved one, the first thought is, no, it's impossible. This can't be happening. It's just out of this world. It is a nightmare. And so there is a denial, and it sometimes takes a while for the rational brain to catch up to the emotional part of our brain. And so denial is the only way to escape it. Sometimes following denial, other emotions erupt. Sometimes they can be in forms of anger, like, why did the person that I love do this? How stupid, or how stupid of myself. Maybe guilt will start to come in. In terms of dealing with terminal illness, what Kubler-Ross saw especially was bargaining at this stage. So once the intellect sets in and the emotions and the denial fade away, bargaining came in. Well, if I can just have 1 year, if I can just have 2 years, or if I can just be able to do this or eat this particular food, then I think I can handle it. And the reality is you are not in control, but you're still trying to psychologically bargain with death or bargain with the dismal situation of loss. Usually then sadness sets in, melancholy, and you begin to realize that, wow, this is a bad situation. I can't deny it. I can't be angry about it. I can't bargain with it. It's not going anywhere. And then sadness sets in. And then finally, acceptance. And acceptance comes in phases, obviously. Obviously, one of the most important parts of acceptance is when a loved one dies, seeing the body. Funeral has a critical role in helping people come to an acceptance that someone that you loved has died. But the acceptance aspect is just the beginning of a long road to adjustment. And I say adjustment again, not recovery, but adjustment, healthy adjustment. Now, what we see in these stages is that they don't always necessarily follow chronological order. They can skip, they can revert back to a different feeling. So there's no technical chronicle order with certain individuals. And it doesn't necessarily mean if you go to one step, you're not going to revert back and fill the others. There's a lot of ebb and flow to it, ebb and flow, until the individual really comes to grips with the actual loss. So when grief occurs, bonds are broken, creating a loss, which creates grief, which is a natural state of adjustment. There's nothing unnatural about grief. It's not pathological or anything. It's a natural stage of adjustment. And it's also a way that we show to other individuals around us that we need help. So grief is bonds broken and an adjustment period. John Bowlby broke this Freudian view that grief is a pathology, and that it needs to immediately have something that was lost replaced. To think that, you lose someone, then you replace that with someone else, that's nonsense, obviously, because there is going to be no equilibrium. The only way is to restore the individual. Unfortunately, when someone dies, that cannot occur. The individual is gone forever, as we know. Death is permanent. There's no way to cross that chasm. There's no way to see that other person, at least in this temporal reality, at least in this world. So because the bond is broken and because it can't be restored, grief hence is forever, varying at different levels of intensity. The stronger the bond, the stronger the grief reaction. Now, if we're dealing with trinkets or something that you lose, a favorite pair of jeans, those things can be replaced. A parent, a child, an aunt, uncle, grandparent, a pet, a dog, a cat, those individuals cannot be replaced. These things cannot be replenished. So we have to learn to deal with that bond being permanently broken, at least in this reality, and to realize that, again, as entitled this videogram, grief is the price of love. So with the grieving process, obviously there's stages. There's a constant ebb and flow with various oscillations of intensity. So we'll have an oscillation that goes high, then down, up and down, up and down. And this is a pretty consistent feeling. So those who are grieving the loss of a close loved one, ultimately what will occur is they'll have a good day, then a bad day, maybe a good hour and a bad hour. And it will be intense. The feelings of sadness will rise very highly, and then they might drop, and you might feel dull. And you might feel maybe happy one day, and perhaps even guilty for feeling no sadness or intense amount of pain. And that can happen. So this oscillation is very brutal, especially within the first months of grieving. But as time goes on, these patterns, these intensity, the intensity of these mood swings levels out so that the oscillations aren't like this, but they become more sloped. And then they, of course, coincide with maybe an anniversary where it might go very high again for that particular day, or whenever we decide really to dwell on it. Ultimately, the grief process looks to find meaning, looks to find meaning of the loss and how to incorporate that loss into one's life narrative, one's life story, so to speak. So if we can think of our life as a book, there's chapters. Chapter 1, we're born. Final chapter, we die. But in between, there are numerous chapters within our book where there are some happy chapters, and there are, unfortunately, many sad chapters. And in the sad chapters of our life, we have to find out how they fit in totally, the meaning of the loss and how it affects the next chapters following. And once we begin to determine how the meaning of the loss is and how we're going to incorporate that loss as part of ourselves, that's when we truly learn how to become more at one with the loss and more healthy, adjusted to that particular loss. However, complications can occur. Complications can arise in the grief process. Not all grieving processes are equal. Not all grieving processes conclude in a healthy arrangement, a healthy recovery or adjustment process. So when this occurs, grief does become pathological. It does become what we refer to in grieving as complicated grief. Now, there are some red flags to look for when dealing with someone who just had a loss occur. On our page here, we have sudden death. No one's ever prepared for that. Someone dies, tragic, maybe in a car accident or an act of nature. The death of a child is always a big red flag. This is what many grief professionals refer to as the ultimate pain that one can experience in life. It's also not natural. It's not a natural loss. What I mean by a natural loss is burying your parents, burying your grandparents. You're not meant to bury a child. So this type of loss is upside down in many ways. The death of parents at a young age, losing a loved one to murder, suicide, natural disaster, or a series of multiple losses in a short span. Now, these things don't necessarily guarantee that the individual is going to experience complicated grief or later depression, possibly, but these are things to look out for in terms of diagnosing grief and where it's going to end up going in the end. As certified grief counselors, we do have a role. A certified grief counselor is someone who deals with natural grief and loss and helps the bereaved navigate the process, the muddy waters of loss and the emotions that go with it. Grief counselors also can identify complicated grief and, if necessary, refer the patient or the individual to a licensed professional counselor, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, someone who treats depression or complicated grief. It's very important to understand that grief counselors who are certified may well be licensed in another field, or they may even have a doctorate in psychology or be a licensed psychiatrist, but not all certified grief counselors have these other professional statuses. So if this is the case, it is very important never to portray yourself as a licensed counselor, and never also to take upon more complicated versions of grief. Certified grief counselors who are only certified but have other professional qualifications, but not the ones that we just listed, are just meant mainly to guide an individual to a healthy adjustment. And these types of grief counselors are found in a variety of capacities, in ministry, priest to minister, pastoral, chaplaincy, at funerals, social workers, school counselors, crisis centers, and just general counseling sometimes likes to offer these types of services. So grief counselors are very pivotal in response to basic grief, the initial onset of grief for national emergencies, school shootings, suicides, and sudden losses. But they're also there to be mindful that they are perhaps not the final solution, especially if complications in that grief evolve. We are the American Academy of Grief Counseling. We do offer for qualified professionals an opportunity to become certified grief counselors. Obviously, if you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a licensed professional counselor, you would qualify. But all those other criteria that we look at, funeral director, social worker, those in ministry, possibly, school teachers, those with education degrees, any type of the theological, philosophical education, psychology degrees, nurses, any type of healthcare professional. We accept all of those types of individuals because grief creeps into every aspect of life. It's multifaceted. So helping those through grief sometimes filters into these areas as well. So if you're interested in becoming a certified grief counselor, we offer a 4-year certification that you can earn. You take 4 basic core courses. They're online, independent study, and you can take them at your own speed and your own pace to earn that 4-year certification. Our link is right here. Feel free to copy and paste that, and you can then review our page. There's a lot of information on it, as well as the courses and the prices to earn a 4-year certification. And if you'd like to contact us, you can contact us at 330-652-7776. Again, that number is 330-652-7776. Or if you'd rather email us, you can email the American Academy of Grief Counseling through info@aihcp.org. Again, that is info@aihcp.org. In conclusion, again, like to thank you for listening today, and to remember again that grief in itself is not a pathology. It is ultimately an expression of love. It is the continuation of that love. It is the price of love. And it's something that is going to occur in our life, whether we are ready or not. And it's good then to prepare ourselves to understand grief, not only to help others, but for ourselves to understand the complicated process of adjustment. I'd like to thank you for listening today, and have a great day.